Hello, everybody. Welcome to Intro to Git and GitHub. I am Tiffany Webb. I am the Director of Product Marketing and Events here at Flatiron School. I've been with Flatiron for about 3 years now, and in that time, we have hosted tons of events like this and workshops. And today we have our amazing instructor and host for the day, Laura. She is going to show you all that you need to know about Git and GitHub. Just want to go over some housekeeping. Make sure that you change your chat to everyone or all panelists and attendees. That way, if you have any questions, everyone can see them. I know a lot of times we think that I'm the only person who has this question. I'm kind of embarrassed, but no, a lot of people have the same questions. And I'm sure Laura knows that from teaching our students often. So just make sure you choose all panelists and attendees, and we can all see your questions. If you are on the shy side, you can ask questions in the Q&A function, and I will try to answer them as they come, or bring that to the larger group. Another thing, it's just Laura and I here. Laura is teaching you. I am looking at the chat function, but sometimes I might miss your questions. No one's ignoring you. Sometimes the chat goes really fast and I might miss it. Just repost the question or post it in the Q&A, and I will definitely make sure to get around to it. Let's be kind to each other and to your hosts of the evening. We're all here to learn and have a little bit of fun. So with all of that being said, I'm really excited to introduce you to Laura Burge, who will be teaching our workshop today. Laura, it's all of you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Hi, everyone. I am Laura. I am an online cohort lead here for the software engineering program. And I've been teaching at Flatiron for about a year, and I love teaching. Coding is a huge love of mine, but teaching has always been my #1 love. So for today, we're going to be going over an intro to Git and GitHub. So my hope is that you will leave this presentation having a little bit of foundational knowledge so that you're armed and ready to practice these skills and even be able to research more on your own in depth. Awesome. I'm going to share screen. Can you see my slides here?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Cool. So our intro to Git and GitHub. First, I want to talk briefly about our learning goals, which I kind of mentioned. #1 is I want you guys to all leave here having a good knowledge of what Git is and how it is used to manage coding projects. We use Git a lot in professional projects. It isn't the only tool that we might use. There are other alternatives, but Git is very, very popular. I also want to go over an overview of a number of basic Git commands that are often used in a workflow if you are working on a professional project. The purpose of this is not for you to sit here and be able to immediately understand all of these commands and have this repertoire memorized in the back of your head, but more just to give you an foundational knowledge so that you could refer back to these slides or to a Git cheat sheet and have a good understanding of what those commands will be and be able to quickly refresh your brain. Something we often say as programmers anyway is not to memorize. Google is our best friend, so don't feel like you ever have to memorize things like syntax or commands. That's why we have Google, and you can always have cheat sheets out while you're practicing Git. The other final thing I want to do today is to get you guys all practicing your first pull request. This isn't required. This will only be optional, but if you choose to, towards the end, you can make a GitHub account if you don't already have one, and then make a pull request on a repo that I have pre-set up and ready to go. And I see already in the chat, what is a pull request? We will be learning that today. This is something that when I was first starting programming, I didn't know what a pull request was until probably about 6-8 months in. So that's why I'm really excited to share this with you all, no matter what level you're at with coding. And you will hopefully leave this having a good understanding of how you could contribute to open source work through making pull requests. Awesome. So what is Git? Git is a distributed version control system. What does that mean? if any of you have worked with like Google Sheets, or you've worked with Microsoft Word and you've used version tracking, or if you've worked on a spreadsheet with a team and you've looked through the version history where it shows like this person on your team made this change at this time on this day, and you can restore back versions. That's kind of what Git is for our coding projects. It's a way we can go back in our history of the project and be able to, look at that history. Maybe we made a mistake, we need to go back to a different commit from a week ago, or I just want to see how my project has changed over time. That is what we use Git for. The great thing about it too is that we can actually also branch off, which we'll be talking about today. So we can have multiple histories at the same time of our projects when we're using Git. This is really beneficial when we're working in a collaborative environment, because you can imagine if I have a team and I have like Susie and I have Joe working with me, we might be working on different features. So we all need different copies of our project so we can work on our features on our own. And then we can later come back together once we've completed our features and merge them all into the same project. So that's the great thing about Git. It allows us to keep track of different versions of our project over time, have that history, as well as have these different branches that we can be working from. Then I also want to mention that Git is both local and remote. I have another slide that's going to be talking a little bit more about what this means, but it's important to know that Git is not GitHub and GitHub is not Git. GitHub uses Git, but we can use Git without GitHub. You could just use it on your local machine. Whenever I say the word local, what I mean there is your computer. So what you're working on is local, versus if we're working on a remote, that usually means it's on the web somewhere.
Here's a quick question from Kimberly. Where did the terminology used to describe how to use Git come from? Sorry if I...
Like what the word Git, where the word comes from? I feel like I learned this at one point and it's escaping. I think there is like a funny history for why it's called Git. I'm not quite sure. I would have to Google that one.
No worries. I'll do some Googling while you go ahead and teach.
Cool. I do have some installation instructions. Don't go ahead and do this right now. You won't need to for this presentation today, but I wanted to have this in this presentation for you all to refer back to later on if you choose to install Git and practice with it locally. We won't be working with this today. The only thing we'll be working on is in browser with GitHub. By the way, that second bullet there, git -- version, will also tell you if you already have Git installed on your computer. So you could run that before you try the install instructions, because you might have already had it installed on your computer. And I also have a little helpful command cheat sheet, which will be shared out later too, along with these slides. This comes from GitHub. So like I said, don't feel like you need to memorize any of these commands today. You can always have a cheat sheet out running. And I see, do I work with PC or Linux? I'm actually usually on Mac. I don't have tons of experience with PC, but I do have some with Linux. There are some commands that are different from especially Windows to Mac, but it's pretty easy to, if you Google, like if I'm using a command in my Mac terminal and you know that one, but you were on PC, you could look up what's the command for this. Like, for example, we use like CD, which is change directory in Mac a lot. Or in a Linux system too, it'll work there. I think CD actually works in Windows too, but I might be wrong. But there's also a command like ls that I believe in Windows, the corresponding command would be dir. So there are a few differences between the two, but I usually work in Mac. Cool. So going back to that concept of local versus remote, what I mean by local is how we can use Git locally is if I have a project in my computer, meaning it's a file or a folder in my computer and I want to track that folder's history because I have like HTML or JavaScript or whatever your coding project might be, I would want to have Git tracking on that file in my computer. That's what I mean when we have local Git tracking. Remotes, that would be things like if we're using GitHub or GitLab, or I even have Bitbucket on here. There's other ones as well. GitHub is very common. I also hear GitHub or GitLab a lot. I mostly have experience with GitHub, and that's where you'll find a lot of open source projects. I also mentioned too that there are other version control systems. So if you are working on the job, you could be working in Git, or you could be working in something else. Some companies even have their own built-in version control system, but Git is still very, very popular, especially for open source work. Cool. This talks a little bit about initializing a repo in your local environment. So let's say you're in your computer and you're working in a text editor. If you know what that is, that's like where I would normally edit code. I would set up my HTML files or JavaScript or CSS. If I'm in there in that project directory, for example, if I change directory using that CD command into that directory, then I can run the command git init. What that will do is it will set a .git folder up that will hold all of our tracking data as we run these git commands and start this history. It is very helpful if you're first working on a project to set this git tracking up right away, so you have history the whole way around. I do make a note here, by the way, about how to remove git tracking if you added it to a folder accidentally. Please be careful if you're not familiar with navigating your terminal using this RM command, as it will permanently delete a file or folder on your computer. That means if you're familiar with deleting files using your GUIs, which is like if I were to right click on something and delete it, it will normally end up in a trash bin. That won't happen if you use RM. It'll be permanently deleted from your folder. So please don't use that if you have any familiarity with unless you have familiarity with your terminal.
Laura, what does repo mean?
Yeah, great question. Repo is what we call basically a folder or tracking when we have it set up with Git. If I have a folder that has a project in it and I set up a repo with Git, then I'm setting up tracking for it. So I'm setting up all that stuff with branches and this history intact, which I have a little visual later on, which I hope will help explain kind of what we're setting up when we're talking about these branches and what our history might look like in a visual way in that repo. But that's what we call them, repos. Cool.
And there's one more question. On open source projects, could you use someone else's code on your own project?
Yes. As developers, we very often use other people's code. So when we talk about open source, what that means is that it's code that we put out there and we're allowing other people to use. And that also means we're allowing others to contribute to it, which is really exciting. And it's one of my favorite parts about being a programmer is that we're sharing code, which helps us like not have to reinvent the wheel all the time, right? Because we can share code. I can use this company's code and this company's code and this company's code in my project without having to create it on my own. A lot of companies support open source work because it can actually make your workflows a lot easier. You can get outside contributions for free, and you can share between companies, which makes pushing out software a lot faster. So we often take other code and use it in our projects. Awesome. So when we're using Git, what that means is we're going to have a couple of things. In our Git tracking, we have something called the staging area, and then we have commits. So I want you all to imagine you're working on a file. Let's say it's even just a Word doc, right? And you hit the save button. The save button doesn't add it to Git tracking. So we need to do an extra thing. What we first do is after we save our file with the new code that we have, we then want to add it to our Git staging area. If any of you guys, I was a big theater person, I actually majored in it in college. You can kind of think of a staging area as, you know, we're setting the stage for what we're choosing to commit to our project. You can also think of if you were a realtor, You might stage a house. We're kind of in that in-between phase. We haven't quite committed that change yet, but it's in the staging area to be committed to my Git tracking. In order to add things to the staging area, we have this command git add. And again, don't feel like you need to memorize these commands now. You'll have this PowerPoint to come back to refer to them. Better just to understand the foundations of what is a staging area. So to add files to the staging area or a folder, we can run git add and then specify that file or that folder. Or if you want to add everything within that folder that you're in, that's when we would run git add -A or git add dot. And dot refers to when you're in your terminal, the folder that you're currently in, which again, might not make tons of sense. You won't need to apply this for the end of the workshop when we make our first pull request. So it's something you might want to ruminate on a little bit as well. So it's okay if you don't fully understand this at the moment. If you ever need to remove a file or folder from the staging area, you can always run git reset and then that file or folder. We use this if I accidentally, for example, had a project where I had a file that had confidential information in it, and I accidentally ran git add -A, and I added all the files in, and I have this project up on GitHub. I might need to remove that confidential file from my staging area, so I make sure I don't push that up to Git. We could also use things like git ignores if you know what that is, but don't worry about that too much now. We won't go too in depth there, more just about how we're adding things and removing things from the staging area. And I see, where are we adding this code? Command line. I typically use VS Code, but that's like a very open question. So I often will work in my text editor, which I choose VS Code. And so when I'm in VS Code, I would have a terminal up at the same time that would be in that folder that the project is that I have up in VS Code. And that's where I would be running these commands in my terminal, but I would add the code to VS Code and save the files, if that makes sense. And then when we want to commit changes, so this is when, I've added some things to the staging area, I'm good with it. This is a little chunk of code that's good to commit. I would run the git commit -m and then a message there about what I just changed. Best practices, if you are practicing your git commits and such, are to make small commits. So every time I make a small change to my project, I want to add it to the staging area and commit it. So I have a really strong history of every little change I've made. Rule of thumb is that any changes that you've made should be included in that message. And we can't have a very long message. I forget the number of characters it is, but it's a pretty short message that we can include. So you want to always make small changes. That's something that's hard at the beginning when you first start. So it's okay if you're making infrequent commits on your first few projects when you're practicing Git. But as you get better, you'll want to make smaller and smaller commits.
There's a question in the Q&A. Can you explain how you initialize a repo with a template, like when you're standardizing use of GitHub across a team?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if I fully understand it. If that means like a pre-existing project, like it's already out there, how would I get it locally? Then we wouldn't initialize a Git repo. If we're working on something, like if you're familiar at all with frameworks or libraries like React, where you would, run a command and then it creates a whole file structure from you and you're working from that kind of template, if that's what that means, then you would run Git init inside of that, the top folder of that. There are libraries and frameworks that already have Git installed and up and running right away when you run those commands. But you wouldn't need to initialize a Git history if it's a pre-existing project with that Git history already, and you're pulling it from a remote, which we'll get to in a minute.
Got it. And then one more question: does using Git or GitHub provide access to your own IP address or email address to the dark web? Does it provide an access point, or I guess better yet, is it secure?
That's a really good question. That might be a great question for our cybersecurity team, which we do have at Flatiron. So I work on the software engineering team. I don't know much about the dark web, I'm going to be honest, but our cybersecurity team probably would. I will say you often put your SSH link up on GitHub, which we won't get in today. So don't worry if you don't know what an SSH link is. But I think they're pretty secure. A lot of teams do use GitHub, so I will go out on a limb and place my bets that GitHub is pretty secure, but nothing's unhackable. So yeah, that would be a great question for our cybersecurity team.
Got it. And then this is regarding to this page that you're showing here. Underneath commit changes and staging area, it says get commit -m. Is the quote part, like add like buttons to profile photos, is that a part of the code?
Yes. So this is what I would run in my terminal. I would run git space commit space -m. We call that when we have like -m, we call those flags. So it's an optional flag we can include. And then after that flag, I would put the quotes. And then inside those quotes, my commit message. The benefit of this, I have a little line below that mentions if you don't include that -m in the message, as in you just ran git commit and hit enter, you will enter likely Vim. Most people have Vim as their default editor, even if you aren't quite aware of that. You probably have Vim, you might have something else configured. And Vim is a little bit outside the scope of this lecture, and we don't include it at Flatiron yet, but you could go in and learn that as well if you want to get really good with Vim. But if you run that git commit -m and specify your message, you won't have to go into the Vim text editor.
Awesome. Yeah, I guess we can keep going.
Oh, awesome. So here's my little diagram that I hope clears up some of like what Git is and why we would use it. What's the benefit? So here you can imagine I have a project. So this is like my repo tracking in an individual folder or a project folder. This branch here, if you can see this little blue branch, I would probably call this one main. So this is like my main branch of code. We usually wouldn't commit directly to this branch unless it's fully working code if we're in a professional environment. Main is usually always working, ready to go. My guess is that these little red dots here are a version where it's like quick fixes. So you can imagine if something really bad went wrong with my repo, as in it all went down. And we've all been to a website where it just crashed and then we have to wait like 20, 30 minutes, maybe even a day for the team to get it up and running. This would be like, hey, I need to make a really quick fix and push it back up to main and get it up and running. So these are like little patches. So this is another branch that we would be using. This branch, I would probably imagine that this could be a dev branch. So this is like the branch that all the developers clone off of or make branches off of. And this is where we would store new code that we're currently working on. So what would happen from here is, let's say we're at this point in history, right here at number 3. We haven't gotten to this part yet. And Susie on my team is now going to start working on a new feature. She will create a new branch off of this one and name it whatever feature she's working on, and then start with that history here as that goes on in a line. Once that feature is done, it will be merged into the dev branch and will delete Susie's old branch once it's completely gone. This might be my branch here. And you can see if I was working on a feature, this is my feature branch, maybe I even had to create a sub feature on that feature. So I created another branch off of that feature branch. This is really, really beneficial when we're working in a collaborative environment because, again, we can have this copy. Everyone can have a copy of where we started when we were working on our code. And then we have our own little ecosystem to test out our code on that copy. And we're not kind of getting confused with each other's repos as we're all committing in. If everyone was always just committing to main here, it would be really hard to keep track of our current version. And while I'm working on my code, I'm working on my little feature, tons of things are changing on that branch. And that can get really difficult to handle and really disorganize quickly. So that's the big benefit of Git or other version control softwares, is that we can keep this history separate. I have a couple of commands here as well. So over here, I have this git branch command. This one's more a checking command, so it tells you what branches you have and which one you're currently on. And my hope is that we'll be able to see this a little bit later on as well, just to get a visual of what it looks like, to see what branch we're on. And then this one is if I want to create a new branch. So git branch new feature. This is like, again, if we're at this point in history on my repo and Susie is working on a new feature, she's going to create a new branch here and name it probably based on the feature that she's working on. Sometimes we'll name it like WIP, work in progress even, but based on that feature. And then to switch around branches. So if I want to see the code that's in the main branch and switch to that, or if I want to switch to dev, that sort of thing, I would run git checkout. And that's how we switch branches. So if I'm on main and I want to go to dev, I would run git checkout dev. And then I want to go to my branch. Let's say it's a like feature. And I called this branch like work in progress, like WIP. I could run git checkout like WIP. And then when I'm on this branch, this is when I would run those commands, add, commit. That's when I'm going to be working on changing my files, adding and committing. And then once I'm done with my branch, my feature is completely done. That's when we'll worry about merging things in, which we'll see in a minute too. These bottom two are commands to delete branches. Don't worry about it too much. This is more later on, you might need these commands because once we're done with a feature, we'll clear them up. But that's what we have set up here. Cool.
And I just want to say, I know there's a lot of people who are feeling lost in the chat. That is okay. I am not a technical person and I attend a lot of these, and I just want you to know that that is normal in coding. That is normal in this industry. I would say, like, I will repost the deck so you can go through it as well. But like, just if you're feeling a little lost, just sit back and listen to Laura and like let it sink in. And then when you go back to it later, you might understand it a little bit more. Laura, you can explain that more as an instructor as well.
Yes, 100%. There's so many times, especially when we're learning a new thing, that it can be really overwhelming. I always tell my students too, I think, especially when we hit a certain age, our brain puts up like a brick wall to new information, right? When something's new, it's like, I don't understand this. And we have this brick wall and it's really hard to break through that so that we can start learning what's really going on. I think the best way to do that is just immersion. So today, I, again, don't expect you guys to understand any of these commands in terms of like you'd actually be able to go out and use them without looking at a cheat sheet at minimum. After we're done with this presentation too, these slides, I'll show you guys these in practice, and then we'll actually work with GitHub specifically. So you'll see some of these commands visually, which I think will help. And then we'll really just be practicing in browser with just a couple of things. So you'll have a GUI there. We won't be running terminal commands today.
Got it. And then there's just one question from John Carlos. Are we typing these commands that are on your left side or the branches into the Git software?
So Git is something you install on your computer and you would run them in your terminal. And the terminal is something that, especially with my new students, it seems like really scary, I think, because we watch a lot of TV shows and movies where we see hackers, right? And the screen is like black and there's this greenish text and it looks like, oh, I could never possibly understand this. So don't worry if you're scared of the terminal too. That's totally okay. Practice makes perfect. And once you get a little bit more comfortable with moving from folder to folder in your terminal, like running CD, then that's when you would start working with Git. Yes, it is your terminal on Mac. That is what the application is called. If you're on Windows, I think it's called command line. I think that's what it is. And again, the commands are slightly different moving to Windows, but cool.
Thank you, Joanna.
Awesome. I have another slide about pulling and pushing to remote. This is more to talk about like what we mean when we're interacting with local and remote, because remembering again that Git is both local and remote. So when I'm in my local environment and I'm having all this Git tracking, I often want to connect to a remote. And that's where it's beneficial when we're working in collaborative environments, right? Because if I just have it on my computer and I'm just working on my computer and I have this tracking, Susie, my coworker, can't access that. So that's where we would use a remote and put up our repo on GitHub, which again, repo is like all the tracking data for that project folder. We would have that remote up there. And then how we interact with it is we often pull and push to it. When we talk about pulling, I like to imagine here's our remote repo up at the top, and I'm pulling data or that code, those commits basically. So that code, I'm pulling that data from the remote into my local repo. So I'm pulling that down. So we run that by saying like git pull, and then we specify which remote we're talking about. Don't worry about this too much. For your purposes, if you're working on small projects, you can just think of it always as origin. So we'd run like git pull origin and then the branch that we're pulling down. So if we're pulling the main branch into my project or into the branch that I'm currently on, that's when I would say main. If we're pulling down the code in the dev branch, I would run git pull origin dev. If I'm running code from my like feature that's in the remote repo, git pull origin like work in progress. So that command, if you've heard about a fetch and merging from just like looking at dev Twitter or anything like that, we won't talk about fetches today, but a pull, when I'm pulling from that remote repo, is doing both a fetch and a merge, which means it's fetching that code over there and then merging it into the branch that I'm currently in locally. We also push, so that's the opposite. So thinking about if I have code locally and I have this commit history locally that I want to push up to that remote repo, that's when I would run a push. And that's when we would say git push, the name of the remote, and then the branch that we're pushing up. So if I'm working on the dev branch, for example, and I want to push that up to the remote dev branch, I would run git push origin dev. So pulling and pushing. And someone mentioned, can you have Python and Java code in the same repo? Absolutely. We put a lot of different things in the same repo. If you have a full project though, we would usually just put that in one repo. We wouldn't often put multiple projects in the same repo because it's beneficial to have them separated out, if that makes sense. But if you have a project that's using both Python and Java inside of it, absolutely, you could put those both in the same repo.
And just sorry to interrupt again, but there's one question in the Q&A that I missed from a little bit ago. So do programmers doing modules for a large program like Windows use Git to get assist or ideas from others working on modules for the whole group?
Programmers doing modules for a large program
use Git to get assistance or ideas from others working on modules for the whole program.
I'm not quite sure what the modules part of it means, because coming from my background as an object-oriented programmer, we use modules a little bit differently. I'm going to look at it in the answered section, see if I can parse through that. I'm not sure if I can understand that.
If the person who asked that question, I don't want to call out your name, but if you can elaborate in the Q&A again, and then maybe we'll get back around to it. How about that? All right. I think
you're saying like, I think I might actually get it now. So like in terms of putting comments on there from our from other coworkers and such, we can put those in GitHub often. So we'll often do that on our remote. And we'll see a little bit of that today when we go to GitHub, and I'll have you guys do a pull request where you'll actually put a description of your comment. and things like that. And we can actually have full message threads on GitHub on things. So combine different sections of a large program, make sure they weld together. Yeah, I mean, we can merge things, and I'm still not quite sure if I understand your question. It might just be something that I haven't worked with, but we can use Git and GitHub to kind of collaborate and move things together, especially with GitHub, because we can make comments on repos and collaborate with our coworkers there, and also tell them all about like different changes we would make and such. Good question. Awesome.
Right, thank you.
Cool. I also have another slide with some other helpful remote commands that you might need to use. We won't go over these too much today because we won't actually be working with taking a remote and putting it local. Again, we'll only be working with remote towards the end. Remember, baby steps are important, so don't feel like you need to master all of this at once. We'll just be talking about practicing with GitHub today. But once you get further in depth, you could look into these as well. Cloning is like if you were to go to GitHub and you saw someone's repo that you wanted to clone locally on yours, you could fork it on GitHub, which makes a copy. So you have a repo on GitHub that's a copy of theirs. And then cloning will actually, we'll specify the link that we're cloning from. So like HTTP, github.com/the username/the repo name. And we would clone that on my local machine. So that will do is it'll go to that website and actually clone that repo and the folder structure into my local computer so that then I can interact with it in a text editor. There's a number of other ones here. I don't want you guys to worry too much about remote add or remote remove. When you get started with GitHub, they'll tell you basically these commands that you can run. So I don't want to go into them too much other than to let you know you can have multiple remote links in your Git tracking. So when we saw earlier, we had origin, we could have more. So sometimes you have origin, and then you might have an upstream, and then you might have, a link to someone else's remote somewhere else. That's a similar repo. So we can add multiple remote links to our local Git tracking so that we can pull or push to those remote links, specifying them. Cool. And I want to make a quick note on merging as well. When we saw with that diagram earlier where we had all these different histories, when we're working on a new history, at some point we come to a close with it, right? So I'm working on a new feature. I have this like button all set up. It's good to go. It's ready to be added in. That's when I would merge it in. These commands do merging locally. So if you're just doing local Git tracking, you'll use these. I don't want to spend too much time on these though, because often when you're working in GitHub, you would actually do this through GitHub. So GitHub has a nice way of actually merging in other branches from their browser. So you wouldn't have to run these commands if you're using GitHub for merging in, which is very common if we're working on open source work. But if you wanted to get really good at just using Git locally, you could practice merging branches locally. I would say this is probably a little bit more advanced, and I would not practice it until you're a little bit more comfortable with those beginning commands like add and commit, especially. But if you do decide to use them, you would want to always check out to the branch that you want to merge into, as in that's the branch that's going to keep the get the new code from that feature branch. Then you would want to merge that in with that git merge command. So if I check out to the dev branch, let's say, and I want to merge my like button feature branch into the dev branch, I would git checkout dev and then git merge like work in progress, the name of that branch. And then I could actually go ahead and delete that branch if I chose to. There's a couple other commands in here that are more just checking your work. So the first one like pulls in code that maybe your coworkers had pushed up, and also checks which branches have been merged. And then the last command would push that new merged branch up to your remote, like GitHub, for example. And Does it flag conflicts before merging? It does, Allison. Great point. It will tell you if there are conflicts and it won't let you merge until you fix those. That's why I also really encourage you, if you're merging branches or practicing this later on, which again is a little bit more advanced, I would do it in GitHub first, because GitHub makes it a lot easier than handling it in your terminal, which you would often handle it in Vim. What that will often look like is something like this. This is what a merge conflict would look like. So if I try to merge in a new branch and it can't meld those commit histories together easily, what will happen is something like this. So if you guys can see this code, it might be a little bit small. On line number 8 here, you see that this is our first bit of the code. So where it says head, they have an H1 here. If you're familiar with any HTML, you might recognize this a little bit. And then they also have another line here that has another H1 tag that's a little bit different. So my guess is what happened here is we had a previous H1, and then both of these different versions actually changed them to be something different. And then we tried to merge the branch together and it said, I can't merge this in really well. So we can see the difference here. We would actually have to edit this. So you would want to delete some of these lines. We would delete line number 8, delete line number 10, and delete line number 12, and then pick which one of these we want to keep. In fact, maybe we want to merge them together and actually create an H1 here that has this text here, but has a class of header. So we would want to make sure that we've just edited this to look like a good file. And then once it's edited, that would resolve that conflict. Cool. And then another quick help command list. Again, this is just for you all to refer to in your own time when you practice these, but don't feel like you need to go and memorize these, just more of a cheat sheet kind of thing. Cool. So I want to quick show what these all mean, because I think it can be really hard to understand looking at these commands in a slideshow presentation, what they actually mean, what they actually do, just going over them. And it's way better to see them visually and get them in practice. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pop into my terminal. And again, don't worry if you have no practice with your terminal. You won't have to practice this today. It's more just to show you guys a visual representation of what these commands kind of look like in your terminal if you were to run them. So here, if I'm in this main directory, which you'll see in your terminal, this is like the main folder of my computer. If I run an ls, or if you're in Windows, you could run a dir. This will show you all the folders here. So here you can see in my computer, I have different folders for application, documents, library, so on and so forth. And I even have a Flatiron folder. That's where I tend to put most of my work. So I am going to change directory into that. So I'm going to run cd, which stands for change directory, and then specify which directory I'm changing into. So I'm going to say Flatiron. And then here you can see in my terminal, it shows me which directory I'm currently in. Many of you guys have probably made a folder on your computer before. We can make folders in our terminal. That's what I'm going to do today. So we can set up some Git tracking. So I'm going to run mkdir. I'm going to make a folder. I'm going to call it intro to Git. And the date today is 9/16. Then I'm going to change directory into that. So now I'm in this folder. From here, I'm actually going to open this up into a text editor today so we can see some of those commands and what we might see if we actually had files on our computer, especially since some people are mentioning like if we had Python or Java or other files or folders inside of this project, how we would track it. So I have VS Code installed. Again, you don't have to install this. We'll be working with GitHub in a minute only. But if I had VS Code up here, and I want to pull this in, I can run from VS Code. I can open a new folder, go in my computer and find that file that that folder I just created. So intro to Git 916, open it up in my text editor. And then in here, this is where we would start running those commands. We could also run it from that terminal I just had open. But if I open this up right away, we should see that I'm in the folder intro to Git in my computer. So here, this is where if I'm starting a new project, I can run git init. And that will initialize a new Git repository inside of this folder called .git, this folder here. So that's what we're seeing there. We won't really go into it or play around with it at all. And you don't need to, just know that now we have Git tracking on this. So now I can, let's say I'm just gonna add a new file. I'm gonna make a file we often make for coding projects, which is an MD file. MD stands for Markdown. You can think of these just kind of like if I were to make a normal document, like a Word doc or something like that, and add some writing to it. That's what we normally use is Markdown for coding. So here I can put some text. I'm just going to say hello world, save this file. And now if I run git status, we'll see that this command will tell me that what branch I'm currently on. It'll tell me I've made no commits yet. It'll tell me everything's untracked at the moment, and this file has not been added to the staging area yet. If I add it to the staging area, so that's when I would run that git add command. And remember, the staging area is kind of like we're setting the stage for what we're going to be committing. This I can run git add readme.md, run this command. And now if I run git status again, then we'll see our message changed a little bit. We can see now these commits are actually, or this file is now in my staging area, but it hasn't been committed yet. See, it says changes to be committed, whereas in the past we got untracked files. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the staging area or things that are yet to be committed. When we first save it, it's not in either. When I add it, it's in the staging area. And then if I run git commit -m and I say first commit, then we have made our first commit in our project. And now I can run git status and we can see nothing to commit, working tree clean. And I can also run a command called git log and we'll see my first commit that I made. So that is how we can work with making Git tracking locally. Now I want to get to actually making a pull request on GitHub. Feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A, by the way, if you have questions on what I just did there. Do rewatch the recording. And again, you won't have to run these commands yet if you're confused by them, but I hope it helped to see the staging area versus when it's actually committed.
There was a question, how do you retrieve your message?
Oh, well, when I see git log here, I do see that message, or when it's pushed to GitHub, we'll see it as well. There is a way to change messages, if that's what you're getting at too. That's a little bit more complicated. I always Google it. And this is where, again, you don't have to memorize these commands at all. Professional developers who are working as software engineers in the field are Googling Git commands all the time. So it's more important that we understand the basis of what's going on behind Git. So I always have to Google how to change a commit message, but we can see it in our Git log and we can also see it when we push to GitHub. Cool. So moving to GitHub, before we move to my little repo here, I also just want to show you guys something with GitHub. So if I go to github.com and I want to see React, for example, and actually I'm going to Google this just straight out, React, GitHub. React is something some of you may have heard about. It's a JavaScript library that we actually teach here at Flatiron. It is actually a project that's tracked on GitHub. And this is the great thing about it is you can go in and explore code you actually use. And this is a repo. So this is their repo here. It's a folder called React that has all of these folders and files in it. And then they have all those branches here, you can see the React developers have multiple branches on this project. And we could go in and actually look at these branches and see what different code is in here, as well as see all these commits. You can see they have 14,471 commits on this repo. So you could go in and actually see these commit messages here where they have fix link, clean up my hard to read code, that sort of thing. Awesome. So moving to your first pull request, this is totally optional, so don't feel like you have to participate, but as much as you want to would be awesome. So on this repo that I have here, you can see I've actually signed into a GitHub that I created right before this. It's like a clone GitHub. It's not the same as the GitHub I created this repo on. So I'm going to show you guys exactly what you can do to fork this repo, make a new branch on GitHub, make a change, commit it, and push it. Make your first pull request, on my repo. So
before we do that, do you mind if I launch a poll and we can answer
Absolutely.
a couple of questions? Guys, it's just one question on the poll. So if you don't mind, why? Oh no, I had it here. If you don't mind, I'm going to launch that now. And in the time that we do that, someone said these commits are code that you could use in your project.
So you would make your own commits for your project. So what that commit was, a React developer was working on their the code, and they changed some things around. Maybe they added some comments. Maybe they, edited a few things here and there to make it a little bit more readable. And then they ran git add, git commit with a message that said, fix all my hard to read code. And then they pushed it up, and then it was merged into the main branch that we saw there.
Got it. And then Carrie asked, is React made by Facebook? Is that why there's a Facebook next to the name?
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
And then John Carlos had a follow-up to the commits code that you use in your project. It's like fix all my hard to read code could be used to clean the coding on your own project.
If that described the changes that you made in your project and what you committed, sure. Absolutely. You could make that commit message.
All right. Well, I will close the poll now and we can continue.
Awesome. So when you get your GitHub account all set up, if you choose to participate, then you can come to this link. I believe it was dropped in the chat, but let me know if you guys still need it. Then you can come here to this repo. You should see a fork button. That's what you want to click on. What fork is going to do is, you can see there's actually some text that gets highlighted when I hover over it. It's going to make your own copy of this repo in your GitHub. So it'll make another repo in your GitHub, which is an exact copy of my repo here. So if I hit fork, we'll see that this is going to fork this code. You can see now it's coming up in my dummy account. And we can also see that in the link at the top here. So this is a totally different repo, but it's cloned or it's forked from this repo here. So it's an exact copy of the old one. Then the next step, and I can definitely repeat these if you guys have questions. So if you guys get stuck in the middle, let me know and we can come back to them. What you'll want to do is, after you've forked it and you've come to your repo here, you will want to create a new branch. So on GitHub, the way you can do that is if you click on this little drop-down menu where it says main and where it says find or create a new branch, you can type your new branch name. So I'm going to call this my first PR, which stands for pull request, which is what we're going to be seeing how to make today. Then I can hit create my branch. Then it should switch to it. So as long as it says whatever you called your branch, you could call it my first PR, whatever you want. Then you're going to want to actually make a change here. So you can see in the instructions, it says to add your name to the list below. So I'm going to hit this little edit button on this README. And then if we come here on line number 11, I can add my name. And if you add a little dash before, it'll give it a bullet point. And then I can write Laura Berge. Once you've added your name to this file, you can just make a new line and add it there. Then you'll come down here. You'll want to commit these changes. So this is where when we were in the terminal before and we ran git commit -m and we put that message, in GitHub, we're just going to put that message here. So what I'm going to say is add my name to list. If you are actually committing contributions to open source work, you would want to leave a really descriptive description here about everything you changed and why, so that they know when they're merging it in exactly what you changed, and they can pretty easily look through your files and know what to look for in terms of what you changed. So you want to leave a pretty accurate description here. For our case, we're just adding our name, so it's okay to keep it simple. Then I'm going to hit commit changes. Once this is committed, we can now actually see in our history here, we can see our commit changes are right here. Add my name to list. So what we're then going to want to do is go to pull requests. If you have this bar already set up, you could use that, but I'm going to show you in case that doesn't pop up, because sometimes it doesn't, how to set this up. So now that we have it committed and you see this commit is one commit ahead of Elbergy 17 main, we can go to pull requests. And I'm going to want to create a new pull request. And what I'm doing when I create a pull request, what that means is I'm telling the owner of the original repo, hey, I made this really cool code contribution to your project, and I want you to include it. I think it'll really help you. Maybe it's a bug fix, that sort of thing. So a pull request is a request basically saying, hey, I fixed something for you, or I added something to your repo. Here it is. Here's my offering to you if you choose to merge it in. That is what a pull request is. So here, you just want to double check what you're merging and what this request is going to look like. So on the side here, it's okay. I'll repeat it too for those of you who are getting behind. Here we can see that we're going to want to merge into Elbergy 17. This is my first pull request. From what branch that we're going to want to merge into is main, because that's the only branch on that remote repo. And then we're going to want to be merging from our repo, which in my case is Elbergy clone, this pull request, but it'll be whatever your GitHub username is. And then I want to merge from my first PR. So I'm taking my first PR and saying, hey, I want to merge this into your main branch here. Once you get this set.
I'm sorry, I'll let you finish this thought and then I'll ask the question.
Once you get this set up, then you just want to hit create pull request. And then again, you can add more descriptive comments here. And then once you do that, you hit create pull request. It'll show up for me on my branch as an open pull request that I can actually merge into my project.
All right. In the Q&A, why do we rename the branch after we pull it?
That's a really, really good question. You don't necessarily have to, but it's best practice. So normally we never put commits for like new features or like extra things onto main. We would always make a new branch that describes what we're doing, or it's similar to that. It doesn't necessarily have to be your feature. We could see in that React, they have tons of branches that are called like O3 stable. These are all the different versions of React. But for them, they probably have versions that are not on GitHub as well, different branches. We normally wouldn't put new code like that on main. It won't break. If you put it on main and you don't create a new branch, you can make a pull request to my repo without creating a new branch. It'll still work, but it's more of a convention thing, if that makes sense. Best practice.
And then the next question is, do you get notification when someone forks your repo?
Yes, I think I do. I'm not sure if I get an email notification anymore because I've kind of set it up so I don't get those all the time, because I get lots of forked repos just from my students forking projects that I'm presenting to them from lectures. But I do get told, I think on GitHub, it'll actually tell me. So somewhere here, if I go to my dashboard or something, I will often see when people pulled that in. Oh, and I think it'll actually be on my other GitHub. So I'm signed into my normal GitHub here. If I go to my, I think just my dashboard, it'll tell me. Yeah, here it'll tell me a whole list of who's forking my repo. And if someone sends me a pull request, I'll usually get a notification as well. So that will happen on GitHub. Yeah, and the best thing too, for those of you guys who do submit this first pull request, and maybe I'll show you guys, I'll merge someone's pull request in right now. You'll be listed as a contributor on the repo. So when I'm merging in a pull request, I'll come to one. Sorry for whoever I'm calling out right now. But here I can see there's no conflicts with the base branch. It looks like a good merge. I can come to the files changed and see the name right here and be like, that looks great to me. This looks awesome. Then over here, as long as everything looks good, I'll merge it in. If things don't look great, I can always leave a comment and say, hey, can you fix this? And then send it back to me. And then we can have that conversation there, kind of like we were talking about before. We can have these conversations over GitHub through these comments on different pull requests and merges and stuff. If I merge this in, I hit confirm merge. Then if I come back to my repo, and I will add you guys all in after this too. Need to go to the one I just created. You'll actually see yourself listed as a contributor on my repo, and you'll see that in your GitHub profile as well, that you are now a contributor on here.
That's awesome. I love that collaboration. There's a couple of comments that are all the same, and I just figured this is a perfect place to bring it. People are surprised that it's called a pull pull request instead of a push request. And then it's like, if you're merging back to the original, why isn't it a push request? Like, do you have any information about that?
That is a great question. That is a really good, I have no idea. I think you guys are very smart though. I think I would have meant the same because we're pushing code in, right?
Yep.
Maybe it's because they're thinking about it the opposite. Like,
I'm pulling from someone else.
Request, yeah, so that I can decide if I want to pull your code in. So I think that's why it's called a pull request. They're more thinking from the repo maintainer's perspective of who's actually going to be merging in different commits. But I think it could go either way. Yeah, merge request. That's also a good one.
Yeah, I think I've gotten around to most questions. Sorry if I've missed you. Feel free to re-add questions in the chat or the Q&A, and I can get around to them if I missed anything you've asked.
I will add your pull request in. So I could even check it and see if it's here. So with GitHub, I just need to refresh this. And I will go through and add all these in after lecture today. So as long as you see your pull request in this list on my repo, so it should show up in Elbergy 17, then you're good to go. And I will merge these in after the fact. You added yours, but you don't see it on my repo. That can happen if you made the pull request to your own repo. So that's like a funny thing we could do. I could actually clone this down from this or like make a copy on this repo and then make a pull request to my own repo. So that might be what you've done. If you go to yours and you see a pull request there, that's what happened. So that's where you would want to come in when you're making that pull request. And I think if I go to my other browser, it'll be easier to see this. If I go back to this repo, or I want to go to the clone one, and I made another change. When I go to pull requests here and I hit new pull request, you want to make sure that the one on the left is my repo, not yours. And then it's merging into main from my repo, but then from yours is coming from your repo and then your branch that you made, whether you made that on main or if you followed and made your own branch there called like my first PR or something like that.
Baron sees his on your repo. I don't want to be using the wrong words, but on your repo or your list. But he says the branch has conflicts that must be resolved. Yes. Was it successful?
Yes, it was. And that happened because I've merged someone's in already that you guys didn't have probably when you forked it. So if I come to one of these, we'll actually probably see one of those merge conflicts. This one doesn't have one. So I'm going to add this one in. It's up there, but that's okay. Let's add this one in. Let's see, pull requests. I'm going to merge it, confirm this merge. And then if I come back over to pull requests again and come to this one, great. Looks like we have some conflicts to resolve. So this is where we'll see what I saw before. So if I come here as the code maintainer, I'm the one who's going to resolve these conflicts. So I'm going to hit resolve conflicts, and we'll see what we saw in that descriptor earlier, right? We see this line, and this line. I'm going to actually just edit this. So I'm going to delete this line. I'm going to delete this line and this line. And then this all looks good to me. I'm going to keep what we have here. So then I'm going to mark it as resolved and commit the merge. So that's how I would handle a merge conflict.
And then there was a question further up, and I don't know if this is too far outside the scope, but how do you update your GitHub on Mac? Is there a way to do that that's easy, or should we just Google?
Update your GitHub. Well, I'm using the in-browser version. Are you talking? Maybe you're talking about the desktop version?
Yeah, I think they have the desktop version.
I don't use that, and I've actually never used that. I have colleagues who really like it. My guess is you could probably just go to their like download the desktop version on that on their site, like Google download GitHub desktop, and they probably have instructions for how to update it. I've never used it though, actually. I've had students also who swear by using GitHub desktop. So if that's your thing, great. Awesome.
And Peter asked a really good question. Technical language is so opaque. I can follow visual examples, but is there a vocabulary list that shows how these actions correspond to non-technical group project or interactions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Is there a vocab list? Well, I do have the Git command list that comes from GitHub, but there are a number of just really good resources on Git out there that I do want to empower you guys to use your Googling skills. This is one thing that we always tell our Flatiron students that we teach them first and foremost is how to Google and getting comfortable with Googling. They do have this cheat sheet on GitHub that kind of talks about a lot of the commands that I mentioned today. And I have this linked in the PowerPoint where they talk about Git status, Git add, and each of these things and what they do. And I do really like this PDF. I still think though with Git, it's really hard to understand a lot of this until you see it in practice. And there are lots of great YouTube videos too that do what I did a little bit earlier, where I was playing around in my terminal and showed you guys what kind of the output of Git log would be, or Git status, or that sort of thing. And I think just the more and more practice you get with looking at what those commands are actually outputting, the more comfortable you get with them. It's more of a practice thing, and it's totally fine to have these cheat sheets up if you're using Git commands. Like I said, professional developers in the work field will use cheat sheets all the time. Google Git commands. I still Google them all the time as well. Absolutely.
There's a question from Allison. Do you have to accept each pull request separately, or can you batch it?
As far as I know, with my limited automation skills, I accept them all manually, and I don't think that there's a great way to batch them, but I'm sure someone has come up with software to batch them together. With GitHub, we could probably look at that and see if there's a batch command, but I think I would just review each one individually. I don't think there's a great way to look at all of these at once on GitHub.
We have a question, just if you can go over how to submit your pull request one more time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you've gotten to, I'll show the forking bit as well.
Yeah, they said they added their name, but they couldn't figure out how to do the pull, but you can go back if you need to.
Awesome. I'm cool. So, well, I'll hit this fork button again, just because it'll bring me to my repo. So if you've already forked something, by the way, and you re-hit fork, it won't like erase your past projects, which is really nice. It'll come back to your previous forked repo. I always think that's really helpful. If you forgot that you forked something in the past, it's not going to erase it. It'll just bring it back to where you had it forked. And then in here, once you have those changes made, and if I go to like my first PR, make sure that the commit is here. So you can look at these 4 commits and just double check that yours is listed. If yours is listed, great, you've committed. Then what you're going to want to do is come over to this pull request tab. And this is where I'm going to hit new pull request, this green button that you should see. On the left is the repo we're trying to make the pull request on. So this is my original repo that you guys are making a pull request on. And on the right here should be your repo. So here you should see Elbergy 17, 916, my first pull request. And then here you'll see the branch name that's here. Then over here, you should see your GitHub username and the repo, which will again be 916, but your GitHub username. And then you'll want to make sure you're on the right branch to merge. So for me, it was my first pull request here, my first PR. And then just double check that you have the changes here. And then if those changes are great, then you can create it. I might need to add another commit just to another quick change just to show you guys that. So I'm gonna come back to, let's see, my repo, which should be Elbergy clone. Or maybe I'll come through here. This looks like I'm not getting there right away. Here we are. If I make another change, since I already made a pull request with that other one, let's go to that branch, my first PR, and I make a change again. So let's just take off my last name. And then I'm going to say remove Bergy from name. And then I'm going to hit commit changes. Then I could come over here to pull requests, new pull request. Again, making sure that this one on the side is Elbergy 17, the main branch. And then on this side, I want to be my repo. So your GitHub username here, and then the branch that you made the commit on. And then here, I don't know, I'm not seeing, I think it's because I still have this pull request open that I can't see it, but there should be some, yeah, it's because I still have this. Let me close it. And then come back over here. I might be able to open it now. Here we go. Now I can see create pull request, which is what you should see. And then you can write your comment and hit create pull request. And then as long as it pops up here, you're good to go. You can resolve those conflicts, but I can handle those too. If you want practice resolving them, feel free. But I can handle those resolve conflicts when I merge these in later on. And you can double check that it's there by, again, going to Elbergy 17, this repo here, coming to pull requests and verifying that your pull request is in here. Can you confirm if I push that I need to do a pull request for each push? You won't necessarily need to do a pull request if you're just working on your project. Like I have a project, which we didn't really talk about too much today, about setting up my project on GitHub and pushing to my own repo. Then you might not need to make pull requests if you're not making separate branches and such. It's only if it's usually if we're contributing to open source work or if we're working collaboratively that we would make pull requests. Because then usually if we're working in a collaborative setting, we want only one person maintaining that main branch, because if everyone's pushing to the main branch all the time, it can get really chaotic. Usually one person is reviewing those commits that we're passing in, or a couple of people like our tech leads would be reviewing those commits and deciding what to merge in. So that's when you would make pull requests, if that makes sense. Oh, where did I create the branch? So here, when we look at, and let me go back to the one that's in my repo. So if I come here and you see this drop down with main, if you click on this, then you can just type your new branch. So new branch name, and then I hit create. And then we have that new branch on this repo.
All right, we got about 10 minutes left, right? Do you guys have any additional questions? Is there more on your side, Laura? And sorry, I pronounced your name incorrectly in the beginning.
Oh, no, you're good. Awesome. I don't have anything else, but feel free to keep dropping questions in the chat if you get lost somewhere.
Yeah. Awesome. If there are no additional questions, any tip to create the README?
Yeah, if you're creating your own README, if you're creating it on GitHub, I think they actually make a pretty easy way of doing it where when you set up a new repo, if I go here to this plus icon and I hit new repo, and then I name this, let's just call this test repo. I can actually add a README right off the bat here. I could check this box and it will add a README to this file, and then you could edit it, as well as like a license or a git ignore. There is also, I believe, a way to add it without it. So let me try that first. So I'm just going to create the repo. I usually create these on my own, so I don't think I've created one where I've had a README in here. So maybe I actually can't quite do that. So if you were just creating it from GitHub, I would probably, oh, here we go. You can hit that button. So here I added this README here when it says we recommend every repo include a README license and a git ignore. I click on this and it set up the repo if you just want to create it from here. Otherwise, if you're creating it on your machine where you're actually navigating your terminal, which again, we didn't go over too much today how you would do that. But if you come to Flatiron, you will absolutely learn how to. It's one of the first things that we teach. Then that's where you would run, you could run either touch readme.md. Touch is a command that creates a file. It's kind of like mkdir, but touch creates a file instead of a folder. Or you could create it from your editor manually, like I did before, where we had VS Code up, and I can just add a new file, and I could call this, my computer is running a little slow at this point. Let's call this test.md. I could just create it like that, and then I can add markdown in here. And again, the MD stands for markdown, which is a common language we use for like documentation and such on our repos.
All right, we have a few questions. Jeffy wants to know, how do I delete repos I've made?
If it's on your computer, if you want to remove Git, like you just want to remove the Git repo from it, but you want to save the file, that's when you would run that RM command and remove the Git tracking. Again, be careful with it. Make sure you know like which folder you're in and what you're deleting if you ever run RM. So I recommend getting a little bit more comfortable with your terminal before using this. Then you can remove that. Otherwise, you can just delete the file as you normally would. So if you're in Mac and you're in Finder, you could delete it, move it to your trash, and then permanently delete it. If it's on GitHub and you want to delete that GitHub repo, they have that in settings. So if I come over, I made that little test repo. So let's go, let's see, I think I had it in here. This test repo, let's say I created it and I'm like, I don't really want this anymore. That's when I would go to settings, and they lock it down so you can't delete a repo super easily, right? Because it could be really dangerous to do it. So they have it in this red box called the danger zone, where you could also transfer ownership of a repo and all sorts of things. Here is where I could delete it. And then I would have to type out this here. So if I type that, then I can say, I understand the consequences, delete this repo. And then I also have to type in my password, and then it will let me delete that repo.
And then is it the same for deleting a forked repo? There was another question around a forked repo. Okay.
Yes. If you want to delete the forked repo, which is a good thing to do to clear up your GitHub after you've had your commit merged in, then you would go to settings and look down for that danger zone and find that delete, and then type that in and you can delete it.
All right, we got 5 minutes. There's a few questions coming in. Can you use the get command with the repository not on GitHub? Just a bit confused between get command and the GitHub service.
Yes. So remember, it can be local and it can also be remote. So when we're working with it locally, that's when we're running these git commands in my terminal. So that's where we were running git add, git status, and git commit. If I'm running, if I'm working in my GitHub, like I'm merging commits in and such, that's when I would use GitHub to merge those in. So for today, we didn't go too much over how to do these local commits. If you come to Flatiron, you will become an expert at these by the time you leave. We talk to our students a lot about good commit history and how to run these git add, git commit, and git push commands. And we spend a long time on it, usually not just an hour. So again, it's okay if you're not super comfortable with them yet. But I would run these here locally, and then I would push up to GitHub. And then if I'm working in GitHub, like merging things in, that's when I would use that.
Juan wants to know, so I think Juan was still trying to download Git in Windows. It gives Juan 3 options. 1, use bundle. 2, use Blink. 3, use external SSH. Which one should Juan choose? Do you know?
I use SSH, which is really nice for configuring with GitHub. And I think that's the way you'd set it up, but I'm not an expert in Windows Git install. So that is something you could also look on YouTube for. And also, if you were to come to Flatiron, we have that in our local environment setup instructions if you're working on Windows.
And I think I'll take this last question. What is repositories and what is projects? Where should you upload code you're working on in GitHub? So I guess what's the difference between repository, what's the difference and projects, and then where should you upload your code?
That's a great question. So when we're talking about a repo or a repository, right, that's all the tracking that I've set up on my project. At the end of the day, what I'm still talking about is folders and files, right? Because that's what's in our computer. So my project often has a main folder that stores all the files for that project. And that's where I would set up the repo for that folder. And that's where when I come, like if I go to my main GitHub, here, I often put my lectures for my students in repos. So I can go to my repos. Again, my computer's running a little bit slow with Zoom today. And then I could come and look at some of the ones I've made recently, maybe, or let's even look at this roster API here. This is a lecture I did for my students. So I pushed this code up to GitHub, but I started with it local on my machine for the lecture. And then I pushed it up to GitHub so that they can actually come in here and review it. And they can even come in here and look and see what the code looked like when I first started, which is where they can come to this pre-lecture commit here. And then they can look at where the code ended at part 3 or ended at part 2 of my lecture, that sort of thing, and be able to explore it in this way. That's really helpful for being able to push up these projects here. When we're working collaboratively, it's even more helpful because then we can commit and make pull requests and such on each other's repos. I hope that answered that question. I might have gotten a little off track on that one.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. I think this was extremely helpful for many. And for those of you who felt a little lost, don't despair. I will send the recording out and you can play around with all the links and you'll have the deck to help guide you. But thanks, Laura, for your awesome instruction. I forgot to turn my video back on. Sorry, I'm talking into the ether. And I hope you all had a very good evening with us, and we hope to see you soon. I will send out the recording and all the resources that go along with this course in about 24 hours. So have a lovely and safe evening and weekend ahead. Cheers.
Thank you all.